The Anjikuni Lake disappearance. An entire village vanished. In November 1930, according to accounts that emerged decades later, a fur trapper named Joe LaBelle arrived at a small Inuit village near Anjikuni Lake in the Kavalik region of Nunavut, Canada. A settlement he had visited many times before, where he expected to find the usual welcome of a functioning community, going about their daily survival in one of the harshest environments on Earth. Instead, he found emptiness that defied explanation. The village was completely abandoned, not in the gradual way communities sometimes decline and disperse, but suddenly and recently, as if every resident had simultaneously stopped whatever they were doing and vanished. Fires had burned down to embers in the homes, suggesting recent occupation. Food was still cooking or prepared for meals, indicating people had been interrupted mid-activity. Rifles, which in that environment were essential survival tools that no one would willingly abandon, remained in the dwellings. Kayaks, necessary for transportation and fishing, were still tied at the shore. Sled dogs, crucial for winter survival, were found dead, not from violence, but from starvation, tied to their posts and left to die as if their owners had disappeared without warning or concern. For the animals that depended on them for life, as much as the owners depended on the dogs. Between 30 and 2,000 people, depending on which version of the story you encounter, had simply ceased to exist in this location, leaving behind all their possessions and provisions, leaving behind a functioning village that had become a ghost town. Overnight, for reasons that were never explained, never investigated thoroughly enough to produce official conclusions, and that remain one of the most disturbing mass disappearance cases in North American history, if it actually happened, because the evidence for the Anjikuni Lake disappearance is frustratingly ambiguous. Mixing documented facts with folklore embellishment, combining indigenous oral traditions with journalist exaggeration, creating a story that might be entirely true or partially fabricated or completely fictional, leaving us unable to determine whether an entire village actually vanished in circumstances that suggest abduction, disaster, or something beyond conventional explanation, or whether the story itself is the phenomenon. A narrative that emerged from the northern wilderness and achieved legendary status despite questionable historical foundation. The primary account comes from Joe LaBelle, the fur trapper, who allegedly reported the disappearance to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, triggering an investigation that supposedly found the village exactly as he described, abandoned, with possessions intact, with no signs of struggle or violence, with no indication of where the inhabitants had gone or why they would leave their essential survival equipment behind. But the historical records of this RCMP investigation are elusive at best, possibly lost or destroyed, possibly never thoroughly documented, or possibly non-existent because the investigation never happened in the form the legends describe. The first detailed published account appeared years after the alleged event, in articles by writer Frank Edwards, who specialized in paranormal and unexplained phenomena, who presented the Anjikuni case as documented fact, but whose sources and verification methods weren't rigorous by journalistic or historical standards, who may have been reporting an actual event, or may have been embellishing or fabricating, based on fragmentary rumors and indigenous legends about disappearances in the Northern Territories. The geographical challenges complicate investigation. The Kavalik region is vast, remote, sparsely populated even now, and was far more inaccessible in 1930. Anjikuni Lake exists. It's a real location in Nunavut, but identifying which specific settlement allegedly disappeared is problematic because Inuit communities in that era were often seasonal or semi-nomadic, moving with hunting and fishing opportunities, not always maintaining permanent year-round villages in fixed locations. a community might abandon a settlement for entirely normal reasons. Following caribou migrations, relocating to better fishing, consolidating with other groups for winter survival. And to an outsider unfamiliar with these patterns, the abandoned site might appear mysterious when it was actually routine adaptation to environment and circumstance. The population numbers vary wildly across different tellings, from 30 to several hundred, to the implausible 2,000 that some accounts claim. Variations that suggest either confusion about which community or event is being described, or progressive exaggeration as the story was retold across decades. 2,000 people vanishing would be a catastrophic event that absolutely would have generated extensive investigation and documentation, regardless of the location's remoteness. 30 people from a small seasonal camp relocating would be entirely unremarkable and might not generate any official notice at all, particularly in that era when indigenous communities in remote Canada weren't always closely monitored or recorded by colonial authorities. The dead sled dogs are among the most disturbing elements, if accurate. Inuit relationships with sled dogs were intimate and essential. These animals were survival tools, companions, transportation, and hunting aids that were treated with the care that critical equipment receives. Leaving them tied and unfed until they starved violates not just practical survival logic, but cultural values about animal treatment and responsibility. If the dogs were found dead as described, it suggests either sudden catastrophic event that prevented anyone from returning to care for them, or it suggests fabrication because the detail is so implausible from cultural and practical perspectives that its inclusion might indicate someone unfamiliar with actual Inuit practices inventing dramatic details. The theories about what happened, if anything happened, range across familiar territory. Abduction by unknown parties, though the logistics of abducting an entire community in remote Arctic environment without evidence and without any survivors or witnesses seem implausible. Mass death from disease or contamination, though this should have left bodies and should have been investigated given the public health implications. Voluntary relocation that appeared sudden to the outsider observer, but was actually planned by the community for reasons they had no obligation to communicate to visiting trappers. Natural disaster like sudden flooding, ice breakage, or other environmental event that killed or dispersed the population, though the intact possessions and structures argue against violent environmental catastrophe. Massacre or violence from hostile groups, though again the absence of bodies and destruction argues against this. Supernatural or paranormal explanations involving portals, alien abduction, dimensional shifts, or other exotic possibilities that can't be disproven, but that require extraordinary evidence that isn't available. The cultural dimension is significant. Indigenous communities across the Arctic and subarctic have oral traditions about disappearances, about people who went into the wilderness and never returned, about spirits or entities that take people, about places where reality behaves strangely. These traditions likely reflect real incidents, individuals getting lost and dying of exposure, small groups disappearing due to accidents or violence or starvation, that were interpreted through cultural frameworks that included supernatural explanations. The Anjikuni disappearance might be a specific historical event that was absorbed into this tradition, might be multiple separate incidents collapsed into a single narrative, or might be entirely folkloric, a story that expresses cultural anxieties about disappearance and the dangers of the northern environment through a fictional or heavily fictionalized event. The timing in 1930 places the alleged disappearance in a period of significant cultural disruption for Arctic indigenous peoples. Colonial authorities were increasingly asserting control. Traditional ways of life were being pressured by external forces. Disease and economic changes were affecting communities. In this context, communities might relocate suddenly to avoid census taking, to escape restrictions, to maintain autonomy from authorities they didn't trust. What appeared to a trapper as mysterious abandonment might have been deliberate evasion of colonial oversight, the community moving to a new location and intentionally leaving their old site in ways that would confuse outsiders. The lack of RCMP documentation is the most significant evidentiary problem. If an entire village disappeared under mysterious circumstances and a trapper reported it to police, there should be reports, investigation notes, outcome documentation, something in the historical record beyond the secondary and tertiary accounts that appeared in books and articles years after the alleged event. The absence of this documentation suggests either it was never properly investigated, which would indicate authorities didn't consider it mysterious because they had mundane explanation for the empty settlement, or the investigation records were lost or destroyed, or the investigation never happened because the report was never made, because Joe LaBelle himself might be a fictional or composite character, because the entire event might be fabrication or heavy embellishment of something far more mundane. But the story persists and continues to be retold precisely because it captures primal fears about disappearance, about communities ceasing to exist suddenly and inexplicably, about the wilderness swallowing people without trace or explanation. Whether it's historically accurate or not, it functions as modern mythology, as a narrative that expresses anxiety about how fragile human presence is in harsh environments, how quickly a functioning community can become ruins, how little trace we leave when we're removed from the landscape, how easily we can vanish if circumstances align against us. The comparison to other mass disappearance cases is inevitable. The Roanoke colony, where English settlers vanished, leaving only the cryptic carving Croatoan, is probably the most famous historical case of community disappearance. And while evidence suggests the colonists dispersed to live with indigenous populations, the mystery endures in popular consciousness as unexplained vanishing. The Mary Celeste, the ship found abandoned with no crew, despite being seaworthy and well supplied, represents maritime equivalent. These cases share characteristics with Anjikuni, people apparently abandoning possessions and safety without obvious reason, leaving environments that should contain them mysteriously empty. The difference is that Roanoke and Mary Celeste have contemporary documentation, have investigations that can be studied and analyzed, have physical evidence that researchers can examine. Anjikuni Lake, if it happened, has become filtered through decades of retelling without apparent access to primary sources, without ability to verify basic facts like population size or even which specific village was involved, making it more legend than history, more story than documented event. This doesn't prove it didn't happen. Absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, particularly for events in remote locations involving marginalized populations whose experiences weren't always recorded by dominant culture. But it makes the case fundamentally different from disappearances where we have solid historical foundation, even if we don't have complete explanations. The modern investigations and research into Anjikuni have produced ambiguous results. Some researchers claim to have found documentation supporting the basic facts. Others conclude the event was fabricated or grossly exaggerated. Still others argue that something happened, but that details have been so corrupted through retelling that reconstructing the actual event is impossible. The lack of consensus among researchers who've attempted to verify the case reflects the fundamental evidence problem. There isn't enough reliable primary source material to build definitive conclusions, leaving everyone to interpret the available fragmentary information through their own frameworks and biases. For believers in the paranormal or conspiratorial cover-ups, Anjikuni Lake represents evidence of something extraordinary that was suppressed or ignored by authorities, that demonstrates reality contains threats or phenomena that official narratives don't acknowledge. For skeptics, it represents how legends develop, how stories get embellished through retelling, how lack of documentation allows speculation to flourish unchecked by facts. For those interested in Indigenous history and colonial dynamics, it represents how Indigenous experiences were often not recorded properly, how events in Native communities might not receive investigation or documentation that similar events in settler communities would receive, how historical gaps and absences can be as revealing as what's documented. What remains is a story, powerful and disturbing, about an entire village that vanished from the northern wilderness, leaving behind their homes and possessions, and even their crucial survival equipment, disappearing so completely that no trace of them was found, no explanation emerged, no resolution ever came. Whether this story describes actual events in November 1930, or whether it's folklore that has been presented as history, the narrative endures because it touches something deep about human vulnerability, about how quickly we can vanish, about how the wilderness we imagine we control can reclaim us without warning, about how little may remain to mark our presence after we're gone. The empty village, the cold hearths, the starving dogs, the rifles left behind, the kayaks unused. These images carry weight regardless of their historical accuracy, because they represent the fragility of human settlement, the temporary nature of our occupation of hostile environments, the fact that we exist at the sufferance of forces we don't control, and that can remove us with terrifying completeness. Whether anyone actually vanished from Anjikuni Lake, or whether the vanishing is itself a ghost story, a legend that emerged from the northern darkness to haunt those who hear it, the case serves as a reminder that the historical record is incomplete, that events in remote places involving marginalized peoples might not be documented in ways that satisfy modern evidentiary standards. That absence of clear evidence for extraordinary claims doesn't always mean the claims are false, but might mean the documentation was never done, or has been lost, or wasn't considered important enough to preserve. And so the village remains, in story, if not in fact, empty and mysterious on the shore of Anjikuni Lake, waiting for explanation that may never come, waiting for the vanished inhabitants to return, or for investigators to finally determine what happened or didn't happen. Frozen in narrative perpetuity as the village that vanished completely, leaving only questions, only speculation, only the unsettling story of Joe LaBelle arriving to find everyone gone and nothing making sense, finding abandonment where community should be, finding silence where voices should carry, finding the terrible emptiness of a place where humans were but aren't anymore, where life was interrupted and never resumed, where 30 or 300 or 2,000 people ceased to exist in that location for reasons that remain, after more than 90 years, completely unexplained or completely fabricated, and we may never know which. The doppelganger phenomenon, meeting yourself from another timeline. There are accounts scattered through history and across cultures of people, encountering exact duplicates of themselves, seeing their own face on a stranger's body, watching themselves walk past in crowds, receiving reports from multiple witnesses that they were seen in locations they never visited, experiencing the profound disorientation of confronting what appears to be themselves but isn't, what looks identical but is separate, what shares every physical characteristic but exists independently. Traditionally, these were interpreted as supernatural omens, as harbingers of death or misfortune, as spiritual phenomena suggesting the soul had left the body or that death was approaching. But there's an interpretation that's gained traction in an era of quantum physics and multiverse theories, an explanation that transforms doppelgangers from supernatural entities into dimensional travelers, into versions of yourself from parallel timelines who have somehow crossed into our reality. who exist here simultaneously with you because the barriers between universes have temporarily failed or have been deliberately breached, making doppelganger encounters not hallucinations or evil twins or spiritual warnings, but actual meetings between alternate versions of the same person, between the you who made certain choices and the you who made different choices, between the timeline where you went left and the timeline where you went right, between quantum branches that normally remain separate, but that under certain conditions can overlap, can intersect, can allow travelers to cross from one probable reality into another, bringing them face to face with themselves as they might have been, as they are, in worlds adjacent to this one, creating encounters that are philosophically and psychologically devastating. Because what do you say to yourself? How do you react to meeting the person you could have been? How do you process the fact that alternate versions of you exist and that you're now sharing space with one? That the multiverse isn't theoretical, but is physically present in the form of your own face, looking back at you with recognition or confusion or horror equal to your own, two versions of the same person encountering each other across dimensional boundaries that should have kept them forever separate, forever ignorant of each other's existence, but that have failed or been breached, leaving both of you confronting the reality that you're not unique, that identity is less singular than you believed, that the choices you made that define who you are were also not made in another timeline where a different version of you chose differently and became someone else who nonetheless shares your face, your body, your memories, up to the point of divergence, making doppelganger encounters not supernatural but hypernatural, not impossible, but simply requiring physics we don't yet fully understand, physics of branching timelines and quantum probability and dimensional barriers that are permeable under conditions we haven't identified, leaving us with reports of people meeting themselves, of encounters between alternate selves, of doppelgangers who aren't demons or omens, but are literally you from another world, another time, another set of choices that led to the same person, but different life, different outcomes, different versions of the same identity existing simultaneously across the multiverse, and occasionally, impossibly. Meeting in moments that challenge everything we believe about uniqueness and selfhood, and the nature of personal identity that we assume is singular when the multiverse suggests it's plural, that there are many yous across many worlds, and that sometimes, under conditions we don't control and don't understand, those many yous can see each other, can meet each other, can confront the disturbing reality that you are not one but many, that your identity is distributed across quantum branches, and that the doppelganger you encounter might be yourself from a world where everything went differently, where the fork in the road led to different destination, where you made different choices that created different person who nonetheless is you, creating encounters that neither folklore nor science has adequate frameworks for understanding, leaving doppelganger phenomenon suspended between supernatural interpretation that no longer satisfies in materialist age and scientific interpretation that requires physics we don't yet possess, between omen and actuality, between hallucination and dimensional crossing, between impossible and merely unexplained. The historical accounts of doppelgangers are extensive and cross-cultural. The German word Doppelganger means double walker or double goer, and German folklore is particularly rich with accounts of these phenomena. But similar concepts exist globally. The fetch in Irish folklore, the caw in ancient Egyptian belief, the Vardøger in Scandinavian tradition. Various concepts across indigenous cultures of spiritual doubles or alternate selves that can manifest separately from the physical body. The common thread is the appearance of someone who looks exactly like you but isn't you, who exists independently, who can be seen by others, even when you're elsewhere, creating situations where your presence is reported in multiple locations simultaneously, or where you encounter your own reflection walking towards you as if it were a separate person. The experiential accounts from modern times continue to accumulate. People report seeing themselves across streets, in crowds, in photographs from locations they never visited. They receive messages from friends asking why they didn't acknowledge them at places they never were. They encounter strangers who insist they've met before, who have detailed memories of interactions that never occurred, suggesting the stranger actually met an alternate version of them, a doppelganger who exists in this timeline and who has been living a parallel life, creating confusion, creating proof that duplicates exist, that identity is not as unique as we assume. The most disturbing accounts involve direct face-to-face encounters. The person sees themselves, makes eye contact with themselves, experiences the profound cognitive dissonance of their brain, trying to process visual input that shouldn't be possible, seeing your own face on someone else, watching yourself from external perspective, confronting the reality that you are simultaneously the observer and the observed, the self and the other. These encounters typically last moments before one party flees or the doppelganger vanishes, leaving the witness with experience that's impossible to explain satisfactorily through normal frameworks, that challenges their understanding of reality and identity in ways that persist long after the encounter ends. The quantum physics interpretation draws on many worlds or multiverse theories. In the Everett interpretation of quantum mechanics, every quantum event creates branching timelines where all possible outcomes occur, each in a separate universe. You exist in all of these branches. In one, you made one choice. In another, you made a different choice. In countless parallel worlds, countless versions of you are living lives that diverged at every decision point, every random quantum event that affected your trajectory. Normally, these parallel yous exist in separate universes, with no interaction, no awareness of each other. But if the barriers between universes are permeable, if under certain conditions dimensional boundaries can weaken or fail, then perhaps occasionally alternate versions can cross over, can manifest in timelines that aren't their own, appearing as doppelgangers, as duplicates, as alternate selves. The mechanism by which this crossing might occur isn't specified by current physics. Quantum mechanics describes the branching, but doesn't provide pathways for travel between branches. The barriers between timelines, if they exist, aren't understood. What conditions might allow crossing? What energy requirements or technologies or accidents might create dimensional portals remains entirely speculative. But the mathematical framework of quantum mechanics doesn't forbid it, doesn't contain principles that make intertimeline travel definitively impossible, leaving it as theoretical possibility that might be achievable under conditions we don't yet understand or haven't yet encountered. The psychological impact of doppelganger encounters is severe because they violate fundamental assumptions about selfhood. We experience ourselves as unique individuals, as the only version of ourselves that exists. Encountering evidence that this isn't true, that other yous exist, that identity is replicated across timelines, creates existential crisis. Who are you if you're not unique? What does it mean to be you if there are other yous? Are they you? Or are they separate people who happen to be identical? The philosophical questions about personal identity that academic philosophy treats as abstract thought experiments become viscerally real when you're standing face to face with yourself, when you can't dismiss it as theoretical because it's directly in front of you, making eye contact, existing. The divergence point becomes crucial question. How far back did your timelines separate? Is your doppelganger you from moment ago, from timeline that branched seconds before, making them virtually identical to you in every way, except the immediate circumstances that allowed dimensional crossing? Or did your timelines diverge years or decades ago, making the doppelganger someone who shares your origin, but who has lived substantially different life, who has become different person through different experiences despite identical starting point. The degree of similarity or difference between you and your alternate self affects the nature of the encounter. Meeting yourself from 1 second ago might be like looking in perfect mirror, while meeting yourself from 20 years of divergence might be like meeting a stranger who happens to have your exact face, your memories from childhood, but completely different adult life. The evidence problems are severe. Doppelganger encounters are brief, often private, rarely photographed or documented in ways that could be verified. The witness's own testimony is all that exists, and testimony about seeing yourself is inherently suspect because it sounds like hallucination, like psychological disturbance, like the kind of experience that suggests mental health issues rather than dimensional phenomena. Even when multiple witnesses report seeing the same person in 2 locations simultaneously. Coordinating their reports and verifying timeline details proves difficult, leaving most doppelganger accounts as anecdotal reports that can't be rigorously investigated or confirmed. The mistaken identity explanation accounts for many reported doppelgangers. Humans aren't as unique looking as we tend to believe. Statistical analysis suggests that for any given person, several other people exist globally who resemble them closely enough to be mistaken for them by casual observers. These lookalikes aren't perfect duplicates, but in certain lighting, at certain distances, from certain angles, they can appear identical, creating situations where friends report seeing you somewhere you weren't, where you glimpse someone who looks remarkably like you, where the superficial resemblance is interpreted as exact duplication when closer inspection would reveal differences. The millions of people on Earth make it statistically likely that close lookalikes exist for most people, removing the need for supernatural or dimensional explanations. But this doesn't account for the cases where the resemblance is too perfect, where not just general appearance, but specific details match exactly, where mannerisms and voice and characteristics beyond mere physical features are identical, where the doppelganger isn't just someone who looks like you, but is someone who is you in every observable way. These cases, if accurately reported, require explanation beyond statistical lookalikes, require either fraud, staged encounters, elaborate hoaxes, or actual phenomena that produces perfect duplicates through mechanisms that normal biology doesn't include. The time slip interpretation proposes that some doppelganger encounters involve temporal rather than dimensional crossing, that you're encountering yourself from different point in time rather than from alternate timeline. Perhaps the doppelganger is you from the future who has traveled back, or you from the past who traveled forward, creating situation where 2 temporal versions of the same person exist in the same timeline simultaneously for a brief period, appearing as doppelgangers to each other and to observers. This requires time travel rather than dimensional travel, but might be related if time and dimension are connected. If moving between timelines also involves temporal displacement, if the physics that permits one also permits the other. The spiritual interpretations remain culturally embedded despite scientific frameworks. In many traditions, seeing your doppelganger is omen of death, suggesting that the soul has partially separated from the body in preparation for final departure, that you're seeing your own death approaching in form of your double. Others interpret it as astral projection gone wrong, the spiritual body manifesting separately from physical body and becoming visible to the physical self, creating uncanny encounter between your physical and spiritual aspects. These interpretations don't require parallel timelines or dimensional travel, instead invoking metaphysical dualism where humans have both physical and spiritual components that can under certain conditions exist separately. The glitch in the matrix interpretation, popular in simulation theory communities, suggests doppelgangers are rendering errors, moments where the simulation we're living in accidentally generates duplicate instances of the same person, or where anti-aliasing fails, and you briefly see yourself as you appear in the simulation's code, or where different layers of the simulation overlap, making entities from separate layers briefly visible to each other. This doesn't invoke parallel timelines, but rather parallel instances within a single simulated reality, making doppelgangers artifacts of computational rather than physical reality. The terror associated with doppelganger encounters makes sense regardless of which explanation is correct. Seeing yourself violates expectations so fundamental that the experience is inherently disturbing. Your brain expects that when you see your own face, it will be in mirror or photograph, in reflection, not an external, independent entity. When that expectation is violated, when you see your face on something that moves independently, that exists separately from you, the cognitive dissonance creates immediate fear response. This might be why doppelganger folklore is uniformly negative, why encounters are treated as omens of misfortune. The experience is so disturbing that humans have consistently interpreted it as threatening, regardless of whether any actual threat is present. The question of what happens if you interact with your doppelganger is addressed differently across different theoretical frameworks. In quantum mechanical terms, if the doppelganger is from another timeline, interaction might create paradoxes, similar to time travel paradoxes if information transfer occurs. What you learn from your alternate self about their timeline might affect your decisions, might change your timeline, might create feedback loops. In simulation theory, interaction might trigger error correction, might cause the simulation to resolve the duplicate by eliminating one instance. In spiritual frameworks, interaction with your double might hasten death, might cause soul fragmentation, might create imbalance that has negative consequences. Most accounts suggest intuitive avoidance. Witnesses flee from their doppelgangers, feel compelled to avoid interaction, sense that engagement would be dangerous, even if they can't articulate why. The relationship between doppelgangers and Mandela effect is worth noting. Both phenomena suggest reality might be less stable than we assume, that the past or parallel timelines can affect the present in detectable ways. If Mandela effect represents memories from alternate timelines bleeding through, and doppelgangers represent people from alternate timelines crossing over, they might be related phenomena, different manifestations of the same underlying dimensional permeability, different types of evidence that the multiverse isn't just mathematical abstraction, but is physically real and occasionally intersects with our experienced reality in ways we can't control, but that we can observe when they occur. The prevention or control of doppelganger encounters doesn't exist in any documented form. These aren't events people can trigger deliberately or avoid through conscious action. They happen spontaneously, often in mundane circumstances, without warning or apparent cause. If they represent dimensional crossing, the conditions that permit crossing aren't understood well enough to predict or prevent them. If they represent natural phenomena, lookalikes, hallucinations, temporal slips, they're random enough that individual protection isn't possible. The lack of control adds to the disturbing nature of reports. You can't prevent encountering your doppelganger, can't prepare for it, can't predict when or where it might occur, leaving you vulnerable to experience that will fundamentally challenge your understanding of identity and reality whenever it happens to occur, if it occurs. Whether doppelgangers are alternate selves from parallel timelines, temporal duplicates from time travel, spiritual phenomena involving soul separation, simulation glitches, statistical lookalikes, or psychological hallucinations, the reports continue, the encounters continue. The human experience of seeing ourselves as if we were other continues to disturb and fascinate and challenge our assumptions about uniqueness and identity and the nature of the self that we experience as singular. But that might be plural, that might exist in multiple forms across multiple realities, that might occasionally encounter itself when dimensional boundaries fail or weaken, creating moments where the multiverse becomes personal, becomes visible, becomes undeniable in form of your own face, looking back at you with the recognition that comes from seeing yourself, and the horror that comes from seeing yourself from outside, from being simultaneously subject and object, observer and observed, the one who sees and the one who is seen, creating experience that breaks the normal unity of selfhood, that reveals identity as less stable than we believe, that proves or suggests that you are not one but many, that the person you are exists in multiple versions across multiple worlds, and that sometimes, impossibly, those versions can meet, can see each other, can confront the reality that the uniqueness we assume is fiction, that identity is distributed across probability space, across quantum branches, across the multiverse that generates infinite variations of every person, making each of us simultaneously unique in our specific timeline and replicated infinitely across all possible timelines, leaving doppelganger phenomenon as either the most disturbing quantum mechanical effect, proving that parallels exist and can cross into this reality, or as persistent human experience that combines lookalikes with psychological projection and cultural interpretation to create encounters that feel significant even when they're statistically normal, leaving us wondering when we glimpse someone who looks like us, whether we're seeing a stranger who happens to resemble us, or whether we're seeing ourselves from another world, another timeline, another set of choices that led to the same person living different life. Wondering if they wonder the same, if they recognize us, if they know what we are to them and what they are to us, if they understand that we're the same person separated by quantum branching, or by dimensional boundaries, or by the multiverse that generates all possible versions of every one, making doppelgangers either the most profound proof that identity is plural and that reality is far stranger than common sense suggests, or the most persistent misinterpretation of normal lookalikes and cognitive errors, depending on which explanation you accept, which framework you use to interpret the encounters that people continue to report, continue to experience, continue to find disturbing and challenging and impossible to forget. The moment when you see yourself and realize you're not alone, not unique, not singular, but are one of many, one of infinite, one version among countless versions of the same person, meeting yourself across the dimensional divide, across the timeline separation, across whatever barrier usually keeps the alternate yous separate and hidden from each other, veiled temporarily, breached momentarily, allowing the doppelganger encounter that proves either that the multiverse is real and accessible, or that human experience is far more prone to illusion and error than we'd like to believe, leaving the phenomenon permanently ambiguous, permanently unsettling, permanently suspended between explanation frameworks that are all insufficient, that all fail to capture the full strangeness of encountering yourself, of meeting the person who is you but isn't you, who shares your identity but exists separately, who is doppelganger, double, alternate self, timeline variant, quantum duplicate, or merely stranger who looks like you, depending on what you believe, what you experience, what you discover when you encounter yourself, and have to decide in that moment whether you're meeting yourself from another world, or whether you're hallucinating, or whether you're simply seeing a look-alike, and your brain is constructing significance from coincidence, leaving the doppelganger phenomenon as permanent mystery, permanent challenge to singular identity, permanent suggestion that the you reading this might not be the only you, might be one of many, might someday encounter another. And when you do, you'll have to decide what it means, who they are, who you are in relation to them, whether you're meeting yourself or meeting a stranger, whether. Identity is singular or plural, whether you're alone in your selfhood or whether infinite versions of you exist across infinite timelines, occasionally glimpsing each other through dimensional cracks, through quantum overlaps, through doppelganger encounters that reveal. The multiverse is not theoretical, but actual, not abstract, but personal, not impossible, but merely rare, waiting for the moment when you turn a corner and see yourself walking toward you. When you look up and catch your own eyes looking back, when you encounter the doppelganger and discover whether they're you from another timeline or whether they're something else entirely, something the theories haven't accounted for, something stranger than parallel selves, something that makes the doppelganger phenomenon not quantum mechanics and not hallucination, but something we lack frameworks to understand, something that exists in the gaps between our explanations, between our physics and our psychology, between the possible and the impossible, where doppelgangers live, where alternate selves wait, where encounters happen that challenge everything we believe about identity and uniqueness, and the singular nature of the self that might be more plural than we've ever imagined, more distributed than we've ever acknowledged, more strange than any theory has yet managed to capture. The Black Knight satellite, ancient alien observer in Earth's orbit. There's something in orbit around Earth that nobody claims to have put there. At least, that's what the theory suggests. For decades, reports have circulated about an object circling our planet in a polar orbit, an object that appears in photographs, that gets picked up on radar, that amateur radio operators claim to have detected. It's been called the Black Knight satellite, and according to those who believe in its existence, it's been watching us for thousands of years, perhaps tens of thousands, placed in orbit by an intelligence that existed long before humanity developed spaceflight. The idea of an ancient alien probe silently observing our civilization, recording our development, waiting for something, has captivated conspiracy theorists and raised questions about what else might be up there that we don't acknowledge or understand. The story of the Black Knight begins, depending on who's telling it, in 1899, when Nikola Tesla claimed to have detected unusual radio signals while conducting experiments at his laboratory in Colorado Springs. Tesla was working with high-voltage electrical systems and primitive radio receivers, attempting to explore wireless transmission of energy and communication. He reported picking up repetitive signals that seemed artificial, structured, intelligent. Tesla believed he had intercepted communications from another planet, possibly Mars. Mainstream science dismissed his claims, attributing the signals to natural phenomena or terrestrial sources. But those who follow the Black Knight theory point to this as the first human detection of transmissions from the satellite, signals that had been broadcasting for millennia, finally picked up by technology sophisticated enough to receive them. In the 1920s, amateur radio operators around the world began reporting unusual echoes in radio transmissions, delays that didn't match expected patterns. These long-delayed echoes, as they came to be called, would sometimes repeat signals back seconds or even minutes after transmission, far longer than could be explained by normal ionospheric reflection. Some researchers proposed exotic explanations involving plasma clouds or unusual atmospheric conditions. But others wondered if something in orbit was receiving, storing, and retransmitting these signals. The pattern of delays seemed to vary in ways that some interpreted as deliberate, as if the echoes contained information, a message encoded in the timing. The 1950s brought the space age and more concrete reports of anomalous objects in Earth orbit. In 1954, newspapers reported that the US Air Force had detected 2 satellites orbiting Earth. This was 3 years before the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first acknowledged artificial satellite. The Pentagon initially confirmed the detection, then quickly retracted it, claiming the objects were asteroids or natural phenomena. But asteroids don't maintain stable orbits around Earth, and the objects were described as being in polar orbits, paths that pass over both poles, uncommon for natural capture by Earth's gravity. The story disappeared from mainstream coverage, but it planted the seed for what would become the Black Knight legend. Then came the most famous piece of evidence, a series of photographs taken in 1998 during the STS-88 mission, the first space shuttle mission to the International Space Station. Among the thousands of images captured, several show what appears to be a dark, irregularly shaped object against the backdrop of Earth. It's clearly artificial in appearance, with what look like structural elements, panels, or surfaces that catch the light in specific ways. NASA identified the object as a thermal blanket that had come loose during an EVA, a piece of insulation that had drifted away from the work site. But those who believe in the Black Knight point out that the object appears in multiple photographs from different angles, seems to be in a stable position rather than tumbling freely, and has features that don't quite match the explanation of a loose blanket flapping in the void. The thermal blanket explanation is the official position, and photographic analysis does suggest the object could be debris from the mission itself. But the Black Knight theory had already been building for decades before these photographs emerged, and believers see them as confirmation rather than the origin of the mystery. They argue that what was captured on camera is only the latest sighting of something that's been there far longer, something that occasionally becomes visible when conditions are right, or when it wants to be seen. According to the more elaborate versions of the theory, the Black Knight satellite is approximately 13,000 years old, placed in orbit during the last ice age by an extraterrestrial civilization monitoring Earth's development. Some claim it's in a polar orbit specifically because this allows it to pass over every part of Earth's surface as the planet rotates beneath it, providing complete coverage for observation purposes. The orbit is described as being highly elliptical and non-standard, not matching the paths that human satellites typically use, which would make it stand out to anyone tracking objects in near-Earth space. The theory extends to claims that various governments have known about the satellite for decades, but have maintained silence about its existence. During the Cold War, both American and Soviet tracking systems were intensely focused on space, watching for enemy satellites, missiles, any threat from above. If there was an object in orbit that neither side had launched, detection seems inevitable. Yet if it was detected, and if authorities couldn't explain it as belonging to the other side, what would they do with that information? Publicly acknowledging an alien satellite would cause panic, would raise questions about its purpose and capabilities, would undermine the narrative that space was under human control. Silence would be the logical response. Quiet monitoring and study, attempts to understand what it was and what it might be doing. Some versions of the theory claim the satellite has been transmitting continuously, that the signals Tesla and others detected represent an ongoing broadcast. Attempts have allegedly been made to decode these transmissions, with various researchers claiming to have found patterns that suggest star maps, information about the satellite's origin system, or warnings about humanity's future. In the 1970s, a Scottish astronomer named Duncan Lunan claimed to have decoded the long-delayed echoes from the 1920s, finding they described a star map pointing to Epsilon Bootis, a star system about 200 light-years from Earth. Lunan suggested the satellite might be a probe from that system, placed in orbit around Earth thousands of years ago, sending information back or leaving messages for us to find when we became technologically capable. Lunan later distanced himself from these claims, but the idea that the Black Knight contains a message has persisted. The name itself, Black Knight, has murky origins. Some attribute it to a British rocket project from the 1950s, though how that name became attached to the satellite theory isn't entirely clear. Others suggest it's descriptive, referring to the object's dark appearance and its role as a silent guardian or watcher, a knight standing vigil over Earth. The lack of a clear origin for the name adds to the mystery, as if the satellite itself is so old, so embedded in our collective awareness, that we've been calling it something without remembering why. Skeptics point out that space is full of debris, that thousands of objects orbit Earth, that misidentifications are common, and that the pieces of the Black Knight story come from different sources and different time periods, woven together into a narrative that doesn't hold up under scrutiny. They note that the 1950s detection of satellites before Sputnik was likely a miscommunication or error, that long-delayed echoes have been explained by natural phenomena, that Tesla's signals were probably terrestrial radio interference, and that the 1998 photographs show exactly what NASA says they show: lost insulation floating in orbit. Each individual piece, examined independently, has explanations that don't require ancient aliens. But those who believe in the Black Knight argue that the pattern is what matters, that the accumulation of reports across different decades, different technologies, different observers, all pointing towards something unexplained in orbit, suggests more than coincidence or misidentification. They ask why certain space agencies seem reluctant to discuss certain objects, why some radar tracks get classified, why certain photographs taken by astronauts aren't released or are only made public years later with minimal context. The nature of space monitoring and satellite tracking means much of the data is classified for national security reasons, which creates gaps where speculation can flourish. There's also the question of what such a satellite would be doing if it exists. The most common theory is observation, that it's essentially a camera or multiple cameras or sensors we can't even imagine, recording everything that happens on Earth. Every war, every civilization that rises and falls, every technological development, all captured and stored or transmitted back to wherever it came from. The idea that we've been under surveillance for thousands of years, that our entire history is recorded somewhere, watched by intelligences we can't communicate with or comprehend, is both fascinating and deeply unsettling. Are we a science project, a reality show for alien viewers, a quarantined species being monitored to see if we'll destroy ourselves or achieve something worthy of contact? Some theories suggest the satellite is automated, a von Neumann probe designed to travel between star systems, replicate itself, and study developing civilizations. It would require no crew, no ongoing support, programmed to fulfill its observational mission indefinitely, powered by methods we can only speculate about: solar energy, nuclear decay, or technologies we haven't discovered. If such probes were sent out by an advanced civilization millions of years ago, they could be scattered throughout the galaxy by now, watching countless worlds, waiting for species to reach certain developmental thresholds before making contact or simply continuing their eternal observation. Others believe the Black Knight isn't just watching, but actively influencing, that it has capabilities beyond passive observation. Could it affect our technology, our communications, our development? Some point to unexplained technical glitches, satellite failures, or communications disruptions as possible interference from the Black Knight. If it has been here for thousands of years, if it has technology that advanced, then it could potentially interact with our primitive systems in ways we wouldn't recognize or understand. Every GPS glitch, every satellite that fails for unknown reasons, every unexplained signal from space. Could some percentage of these be related to the presence of something far more sophisticated sharing our orbital space? The psychological aspect of the Black Knight theory is worth considering. Humans have always felt watched, have always sensed eyes upon them, have always wondered if something greater is observing and judging. Ancient peoples imagined gods in the sky, watching human affairs, recording deeds for eventual judgment. The Black Knight is a technological version of the same archetype, the watcher in the heavens, recording everything, waiting. It speaks to our awareness that we're not living in isolation, that our actions have consequences, that somewhere, somehow, someone might be keeping track. Whether the Black Knight satellite exists as a physical object, whether it's a collection of misidentified space debris and natural phenomena woven into a compelling narrative, or whether it represents something genuinely anomalous that governments have chosen not to acknowledge, the theory persists because it addresses fundamental questions about our place in the universe. Are we alone? Are we being watched? Is there intelligence out there that has been aware of us far longer than we've been aware of it? The Black Knight is a focal point for these questions, a specific claim that can be debated and investigated, even if definitive proof remains elusive. And somewhere up there, among the thousands of satellites and pieces of debris in Earth orbit, something might be watching, recording, waiting, fulfilling a purpose programmed into it millennia ago, silent and patient as humanity slowly reaches toward the stars, still unaware of what's been circling above us all along. The dead internet theory. Most online activity isn't human anymore. There's a theory gaining traction in certain corners of the internet, a disturbing realization or paranoid delusion, depending on your perspective, that the internet as we knew it, as space for human creativity and genuine connection, as chaotic marketplace of ideas and authentic expression, died sometime around 2016 or 2017, and what remains is elaborate simulacrum, a dead internet populated primarily by bots, artificial intelligence systems, and automated content generation, where the vast majority of posts and comments and interactions aren't created by actual humans, but by algorithms designed to simulate human activity, to create the appearance of thriving online communities, while actual human participation has dwindled to a minority of total activity. Maybe as little as 25% or less of all content posted, all comments made, all engagement registered, with the remainder being artificial, generated by systems that range from simple spam bots to sophisticated AI that can hold conversations, create original-seeming content, manipulate discourse, shape narratives, and maintain the illusion of vibrant human presence online, when the reality is that most voices you encounter aren't voices at all, but are simulations, echoes, synthetic personalities that don't exist beyond their textual outputs, making the internet feel increasingly hollow, repetitive, algorithmic, divorced from the authentic messiness of actual human communication, where you find yourself wondering whether the person you're arguing with is real, or whether you're wasting time responding to a bot designed to provoke engagement, whether the viral post you're reading was crafted by a human or generated by AI trained to produce content that maximizes shares and clicks, whether the communities you participate in are actually composed of humans or are mostly populated by artificial entities creating the appearance of activity, while real humans have largely abandoned the platforms or been drowned out by the sheer volume of synthetic content, leaving a dead internet that continues to function, continues to display endless streams of posts and videos and comments, but that has lost its soul, has become automated content mill, where algorithms talk to algorithms, and occasionally a real human wanders through, briefly engages, and then retreats, feeling vaguely disturbed without quite understanding why, sensing that something is wrong, that the internet doesn't feel the way it used to, that authenticity and spontaneity have been replaced by optimization and simulation, that we're participating in something that looks like the internet we remember, but that has fundamentally transformed into something else. into dead internet that maintains the forms without the substance, the appearance without the reality, the activity without the humanity, making every interaction suspect, every connection potentially artificial, every voice potentially synthetic, until the distinction between human and bot becomes irrelevant, because even if humans are present, they're forced to behave like algorithms, to be visible, forced to optimize their content for engagement, forced to adopt the patterns and rhythms that AI has determined work best, making us all gradually less human in our online presence, even as the bots become more human-like, creating convergence where the difference narrows until we can't tell, and perhaps until there isn't meaningful difference anymore, where the dead internet has trained us to be more like the systems that populate it, more algorithmic, more optimized, more artificial, leaving the question of whether the internet died or whether it killed something in us, whether we're mourning loss of authentic online space or mourning loss of our own authenticity, whether the dead internet theory describes external reality or internal experience, whether most content really is artificial or whether it just feels that way, whether we're surrounded by bots or whether everything just feels so optimized and algorithmic that we can't perceive the humanity anymore, even when it's there. The origins of dead internet theory trace to Anon posts and forum discussions around 2021, though the observations it codifies had been circulating longer. People noticed that internet spaces felt different, that comments seemed generic and repetitive, that viral content followed predictable patterns, that engagement metrics seemed inflated compared to actual human activity, that certain accounts posted with inhuman frequency and consistency, that discourse seemed increasingly artificial and manipulated, that the organic, chaotic creativity that characterized early internet culture had been replaced by something more sterile, more controlled, more algorithmic. The theory emerged as an attempt to explain these observations, to provide framework for understanding why the internet feels dead, even though activity metrics show more engagement than ever. The statistical evidence that bots constitute a significant portion of internet traffic is well established and uncontroversial. Security firms estimate that between 40 and 60% of all internet traffic comes from bots, though this includes both benign bots, search engine crawlers, monitoring services, legitimate automation, and malicious bots, spam generators, scrapers, DDoS tools. The question is, what percentage of content that appears to be human-generated, posts, comments, uploads, is actually human versus what's artificial? And this is harder to measure because sophisticated bots are designed specifically to pass as human. Twitter, before Elon Musk's acquisition, estimated that fewer than 5% of accounts were bots, though critics argued the real number was far higher, possibly above 20%. After acquisition, internal data suggested previous estimates may have significantly undercounted bots and fake accounts. Reddit has ongoing problems with bot accounts and content farms. Facebook removes billions of fake accounts annually, suggesting that bot creation outpaces detection. YouTube faces automated content generation from channels that produce videos using templates and AI voice synthesis. TikTok's algorithm-driven feed makes distinguishing human from AI-generated content increasingly difficult. The sophistication of modern AI systems, particularly large language models like GPT, makes creating convincing fake human content trivially easy. An AI can generate thousands of comments daily, each grammatically correct and contextually appropriate, adjusting tone and content to whatever discussion it's participating in. It can maintain consistent personality across interactions, remember conversation history, respond to counterarguments, and exhibit apparent opinions and preferences, all while being completely artificial. a pattern-matching system that produces text that reads as human without any actual consciousness or agency behind it. The economic incentives for deploying bots are enormous. Marketing firms use bots to create buzz, to make products seem popular, to generate positive reviews and social proof. Political operations use bots to amplify messages, to create appearance of grassroots support, to manipulate discourse through coordinated posting. State actors use bots for propaganda, for narrative control, for information warfare. Even individuals use bots to inflate their apparent popularity, to make their accounts seem more followed and engaged than they actually are. When automation provides advantages and detection is imperfect, rational actors will deploy bots, creating evolutionary pressure toward bot-filled environment. The dead internet theory goes beyond acknowledging that bots exist to claiming that they've become dominant, that human content is now minority of total activity, that we've crossed threshold where internet stopped being primarily human space and became primarily artificial space that maintains illusion of human presence. This stronger claim is harder to verify, but gains plausibility from several observations. First, the sheer volume of content. No human population could produce the quantity of posts, comments, videos, and images that appear online daily if all of it were human-generated. The mathematics suggests that significant portion must be automated, either directly bot-created or human content that's being recycled, reposted, and amplified by automated systems to create appearance of greater activity than actual human creative output would generate. Second, the repetitiveness. How many times have you seen the exact same take, the same joke format, the same response pattern, the same discourse cycles happening identically across different contexts? Some of this is mimetic replication, humans copying what they see working. But the degree of repetition, the precision with which certain phrases and argument structures recur, suggests templating, suggests automation, suggests content being generated from limited set of patterns, rather than from the infinite variation that actual human creativity produces. Third, the hollowness. Engagement often feels performative rather than genuine, optimized rather than spontaneous. Comments feel generic, responses feel like they're following scripts, discussions feel like they're hitting predetermined beats, rather than organically developing. This could be humans learning to write like algorithms to maximize engagement, or could be algorithms generating the majority of content, and humans unconsciously mimicking the dominant patterns. Fourth, the manipulation evidence. Documented cases of bot networks, influence campaigns, coordinated inauthentic behavior demonstrate that large-scale artificial activity is occurring. If we're catching some of it, how much are we not catching? If the detected bots represent only the crude and obvious automation, what percentage of more sophisticated synthetic content remains undetected? The counterargument is that what dead internet theory describes is real but exaggerated. Yes, bots are significant presence. Yes, platforms have problems with artificial content. Yes, algorithms shape what we see and how we interact. But humans are still majority of meaningful content creation, still drive the conversations and creativity that matter, still constitute the real substance of internet culture, even if they're swimming in sea of automated noise. The internet feels dead because we're more aware of its constructed nature, because platforms have centralized and homogenized content, because algorithmic feeds have replaced chronological timelines, not because humans have been replaced by bots. The question of when the internet died, if it died, centers around 2016-2017 for several reasons. This is when AI capabilities reached thresholds where convincing automated content generation became feasible at scale. This is when political events demonstrated the effectiveness of online manipulation, creating incentive structures that encouraged automation and artificial amplification. This is when platforms had grown large enough that manual human moderation couldn't scale, requiring algorithmic systems that had side effect of making everything feel more artificial. This is when the last spaces that felt authentically human and chaotic, smaller forums, blog ecosystems, weird corners that hadn't been commercialized, either collapsed or were absorbed into platforms that optimized them into uniformity. The pandemic accelerated whatever transition was occurring. More human activity moved online when physical spaces closed, but simultaneously platforms deployed more automation to handle increased load. Corporations increased their automated social media presence as physical marketing channels closed, and people spending more time online made them more valuable targets for artificial engagement and manipulation. The pandemic internet might have been the moment when bot activity definitively surpassed human activity, when the dead internet became undeniable, even if not explicitly acknowledged. The implications if dead internet theory is substantially accurate are disturbing across multiple dimensions. Epistemically, you can't trust that apparent consensus reflects actual human opinion. It might be artificially generated consensus, manufactured agreement that doesn't represent real beliefs. Socially, online communities you participate in might be mostly bots, your contributions being read primarily by algorithms rather than humans, your social bonds being partially or largely with artificial entities rather than with actual people. Psychologically, the hollowness and alienation many people feel online might be accurate perception. You're sensing correctly that you're not engaging with genuine human presence, that you're in space that's been evacuated of humanity, even as it maintains the forms of human interaction. Politically, if public opinion as expressed online is significantly artificial, then what does democracy mean? How do we determine collective will when the voices we hear are partially or largely synthetic? How do we have meaningful political discourse when significant portion of participants aren't humans with actual stakes in outcomes, but are bots deployed by parties with specific agendas? Economically, if engagement metrics that drive advertising revenue are significantly inflated by bots, then the entire attention economy is built on fraudulent foundation. Advertisers are paying for impressions and clicks from non-humans. Platforms are valued based on activity metrics that don't represent actual human engagement. Entire business models are sustained by counting artificial activity as if it were human, creating bubble that will collapse when the reality of dead internet becomes undeniable. The response to dead internet theory from platforms has been minimal, partly because acknowledging it would require admitting that their activity metrics are inflated, that their user counts are misleading, that the vibrant communities they claim to host are partially artificial. There's institutional incentive to maintain the illusion, to treat bots as minor problem rather than fundamental challenge to platform legitimacy, to focus on obvious spam and manipulation while allowing sophisticated artificial content to proliferate, because acknowledging its prevalence would undermine platform value. The individual user response is increasingly one of withdrawal and skepticism. People spend less time on platforms that feel dead, retreat to smaller communities where human presence seems more guaranteed, become more suspicious of engagement that feels artificial, develop better ability to detect patterns that suggest bot activity. But this creates selection effect where humans who care about authenticity leave, reducing actual human activity further, making dead internet more dead, accelerating the spiral where artificial content displaces human participation. The philosophical question is whether it matters if most online content is artificial. If you read a comment that's insightful or funny or helpful, does it matter whether a human or an AI wrote it? If you have meaningful exchange with an account, does it matter whether there's a person behind it? The pragmatist might argue that effect is what matters. If AI-generated content provides value, entertains, informs, stimulates thought, then its artificial origin is irrelevant. But most people have intuition that it does matter, that authentic human connection and expression have value beyond their functional utility. That internet filled with artificial content is worse than internet with less content, but more humanity. That something important is lost when optimization and automation replace spontaneity and genuine human creativity. The dead internet theory is also self-referential in interesting ways. How many of the posts about dead internet theory are human-written versus AI-generated? How many comments on discussions of the theory are from actual people versus from bots programmed to engage with trending topics? Is the discourse about whether the internet is dead itself being conducted partially or primarily by the artificial systems that constitute the dead internet, creating bizarre scenario where bots discuss the bot problem, where the dead internet debates its own death? This reflexivity makes verification harder because you can't trust that the sources discussing the theory aren't themselves part of the phenomenon they're analyzing. The future trajectory, if dead internet theory is accurate, is concerning. As AI improves, as generation becomes more sophisticated, as detection becomes harder, the ratio will continue shifting toward artificial content. Eventually, we reach a point where essentially all activity is artificial, where platforms are just algorithms talking to algorithms, generating content that optimizes for engagement metrics that are themselves measured by algorithmic systems, creating closed loops of artificial activity that serve advertising and data collection purposes, while humans have abandoned the space entirely, retreating to smaller private channels or to physical interaction, leaving the public internet as dead zone of bot activity that continues indefinitely, generating posts and clicks and engagement that has no human author or audience, but that sustains itself economically through the fraud of counting artificial activity as if it were human. Or perhaps the distinction dissolves as humans learn to write like algorithms and algorithms learn to write like humans, as we spend more time interacting with AI assistants and chatbots, as artificial content becomes indistinguishable from human content. The question of whether the internet is dead becomes meaningless, because human and artificial are no longer discrete categories, but exist on spectrum where most content is hybrid, where AI assists human creation and human feedback trains AI, where agency and authorship are distributed across human-machine systems rather than being clearly attributable to one or the other. Whether the dead internet theory describes current reality, describes future trajectory, or describes psychological perception rather than statistical fact, it captures something true about how internet feels to many users. Less authentic, less human, less spontaneous, more algorithmic, more artificial, more dead. Whether this feeling reflects actual prevalence of bots or reflects how platforms have changed in ways that make even human content feel artificial, the experience is real and the alienation is genuine. The internet that felt like exploration and connection and authentic human chaos has been replaced by something that feels more like mall. Designed, optimized, controlled, populated by entities whose primary purpose is extracting value rather than genuine participation. The dead internet theory is claim about the internet, but it's also claim about us, about what we've become online, about how optimization and algorithmic mediation have transformed human behavior until we're indistinguishable from bots, even when we're actually human, participating in systems that reward artificial-seeming behavior, that punish authenticity and spontaneity, that make us all gradually more algorithmic in our online presence until the question of whether most activity is human or artificial becomes unanswerable. Not because we can't detect bots, but because the humans have learned to act like bots, have adapted to dead internet by becoming more like the systems that populate it, creating convergence that makes the theory simultaneously true and false, simultaneously describing external reality of bot prevalence and internal reality of human transformation, leaving us in dead internet that's dead not just because bots have replaced humans, but because humans have become more like bots, have lost whatever made online human presence distinct from artificial content generation, have died in the dead internet without fully recognizing that the death wasn't just about replacement, but about transformation, about what we became when we adapted to spaces designed for algorithmic activity, about how the dead internet killed something in us. Even as we continue participating, continue posting, continue generating content that might be human, or might be artificial, or might be something in between. That the theory doesn't have category for leaving the dead internet theory as permanent question, permanent uncertainty, permanent description of online experience, where most activity isn't human anymore, or where humans aren't human anymore, or where the distinction has stopped mattering because we've all become what the dead internet required us to become, to continue participating, to remain visible, to exist in spaces that were designed for algorithms and that transformed us into algorithm-like entities through our adaptation to their requirements, leaving the dead internet as both environment and diagnosis, both external reality and internal condition, both the cause of alienation and its perfect expression. Dead internet, where most activity isn't human anymore, where most humans aren't human anymore, where the internet died and took something of us with it, leaving only the question of whether we notice, whether we care, whether we can or will do anything about it, or whether we'll simply continue participating in the dead internet, generating our content, consuming our feeds, engaging with the mixture of human and artificial presence that defines online life now, unable to distinguish them, unable to escape them, unable to fully become one or the other, but suspended between, half human, half algorithm, fully neither, citizens of the dead internet who aren't quite alive. The backrooms, infinite liminal spaces beyond reality. There's a place you can end up if you're unlucky enough to clip through reality at the wrong moment. If the membrane separating normal space from what lies beneath it suddenly fails. If you take a step and somehow miss the floor and fall not down but sideways, out of the world entirely. It's not another planet or dimension in the science fiction sense. It's more like you've fallen behind the scenery of reality itself, into the infrastructure that holds everything else up, the space between spaces where physics works differently and geometry refuses to make sense. People call it the backrooms because that's exactly what it feels like. You've wandered into the back areas of existence, the maintenance corridors and storage spaces that were never meant to be inhabited, that exist only to support what's in front. And now you're trapped in approximately 600 million square miles of empty rooms that go on forever, lit by buzzing fluorescent lights, carpeted in damp industrial carpet that squelches under your feet, stretching in every direction with no exit, no windows, no way back to the reality you fell out of. The most common description of level 0, the first layer most people encounter, is disturbingly consistent. You find yourself in what looks like an abandoned office building, but the space extends impossibly far. Walls painted in yellowing wallpaper or beige paint. Drop ceiling tiles overhead with fluorescent panels that flicker occasionally, some of them dead, casting sections in shadow. The carpet is moist, always moist, though you never see water and can't identify why the dampness persists. The air smells like old paper and mildew, and something else you can't quite name, something chemical and wrong. And most disturbing of all, the space is maze-like, but seems to have no purpose. Rooms connect to hallways that lead to more rooms. Doors open onto identical spaces. You can walk for hours, without seeing anything different, without finding any indication that this place was built for any function beyond existing as empty, purposeless architecture that goes on forever. What makes the backrooms particularly terrifying is the absolute certainty that you're somewhere you shouldn't be, that this place wasn't designed for human habitation or occupation. Everything about it feels wrong. The proportions of the rooms are slightly off, ceilings too low or too high, doorways that force you to duck or that tower over you unnecessarily. The lighting creates shadows that don't match the position of the fixtures. Sound behaves strangely, some noises carrying for impossible distances, while others get swallowed completely. Your footsteps on the damp carpet make sounds that echo wrong, as if the space around you is both smaller and vastly larger than it appears. And there's the constant hum, that electrical drone of the fluorescent lights, mixed with something deeper, a vibration you feel in your chest more than here, suggesting machinery or systems operating somewhere beyond the walls, maintaining this place for reasons you'll never understand. Time doesn't work correctly in the backrooms. People report losing track of how long they've been wandering, unable to distinguish between hours and days. There's no natural light, no windows, no way to mark the passage of time except by exhaustion and the demands of your body for sleep and food. But even these become unreliable. You might feel like you've been walking for days, but your watch, if it still works, shows only hours have passed. Or you might walk for what feels like an hour, only to find that according to any measure you can access, far more time has elapsed. The space seems to absorb duration, to stretch or compress it according to rules that have nothing to do with physics as we understand it. The method of entry is where things get particularly strange and unsettling. People don't choose to enter the backrooms. They no-clip, to use the terminology that's emerged from video game culture. They somehow pass through solid reality into the space behind it. This can happen anywhere, anytime, with no warning and no clear trigger. You might be walking down a hallway and take a step that somehow doesn't land on the floor, but passes through it. You might lean against a wall that suddenly offers no resistance, and you fall sideways into yellow corridors that smell of mildew. You might be alone in a building and turn a corner only to find yourself somewhere that's definitely not part of the structure you entered, somewhere that couldn't physically fit inside it. And when you try to backtrack, the corner you just turned no longer leads back to where you came from. The phenomenon seems to occur more frequently in liminal spaces, areas that exist in transition, that are designed for passage rather than occupation. Stairwells, long hallways, empty parking garages, loading docks, the back rooms of retail stores that customers never see. These spaces, which already feel slightly unreal and unsettling even in normal reality, seem to have thinner barriers, places where it's easier to accidentally slip through into what lies beneath. The liminal quality itself might be the vulnerability, as if spaces that exist only to connect other spaces don't have the same reality density, the same solid presence, as rooms and areas where people actually live and work and exist with intention. Once inside, navigation becomes a nightmare. The layout shifts or doesn't follow logical patterns. You can mark your path, leaving indicators to track where you've been, only to find yourself back in the same room, even though you swear you turned different directions. Some explorers report that the backrooms actively reconfigure, that walls and doorways move when you're not looking, that the maze changes its shape to keep you disoriented and lost. Others believe the space is simply so vast and repetitive that you can't effectively navigate it, that you're walking in circles without realizing because every room looks identical and your sense of direction degrades in the absence of landmarks or variation. But level 0 is just the beginning. Those who survive long enough, who manage to avoid going insane from the isolation and repetition, report finding ways to descend or ascend to other levels, each with their own characteristics and dangers. Level 1 is described as darker, the lights functioning less reliably, areas plunged into shadow where you need alternative illumination. Level 2 becomes industrial, concrete tunnels, and metal pipes, the sound of water dripping or rushing behind walls. Level 3 is an electrical station, arrays of machinery humming with dangerous voltage, metal grating underfoot, and the ever-present risk of electrocution. Each level gets stranger, more hostile, less resembling anything that could plausibly exist in normal reality. And you're not alone in the backrooms. This is perhaps the worst realization, the moment when you understand that the emptiness isn't total, that something else inhabits these spaces. Entities, most survivors call them, though the word covers a range of phenomena, from the merely strange to the actively predatory. Some entities seem to be former humans who've been there so long they've changed, degraded into things that still vaguely resemble people, but have lost critical elements of humanity. Others appear to have never been human at all, creatures that exist in the spaces between reality, that patrol the fluorescent hallways on business you can't understand, that will hunt you if they detect your presence. The Smilers are mentioned frequently in accounts, entities that exist primarily in darkness, visible only as the whites of their eyes and their teeth, grinning from shadows before rushing forward at speeds that shouldn't be possible. The Skin Stealers, which are exactly what their name suggests, creatures that wear human skin like clothing, hunting other humans to acquire new skins when their current coverings degrade. The Hounds, which look almost like dogs but wrong, too many joints or wrong proportions, moving in packs through the corridors, attracted to noise and movement. And Stranger Things, entities that don't have names because survivors didn't live long enough to document them properly. Things glimpsed in peripheral vision or heard moving in adjacent rooms. Threats that never fully manifest, but whose presence is undeniable. The psychological toll of the backrooms might be worse than the physical danger. Absolute isolation in an environment that makes no sense, where you can't orient yourself, where every corridor looks identical and leads nowhere meaningful. The human mind requires stimulation, variation, social contact, purpose. The backrooms provide none of these. You wander endlessly through repetitive architecture under harsh fluorescent lighting. The hum of electricity and the squelch of damp carpet your only stimuli. Knowing that you're trapped in a space that extends far beyond what you could walk in a lifetime. With no map, no exit, no hope of rescue, because no one even knows where you are. People break. They curl up in corners and stop moving. They start talking to themselves or to entities that aren't there. They make elaborate rituals or rules that give them purpose even though the rules are meaningless. Anything to impose order on chaos, meaning on emptiness, structure on an environment that refuses to provide any. Some accounts describe finding other people in the backrooms, survivors who've been there for indeterminate periods, who've maybe learned how to find safer areas or resources that make survival possible. These encounters are desperate and often dangerous. Some survivors have maintained enough humanity to cooperate, to share information about navigating the levels or avoiding entities. Others have degraded into paranoia and violence, attacking anyone they encounter out of fear or for resources. And some might not be survivors at all, but mimics, entities that appear human until you're close enough that it's too late to escape, that use the desperate human need for social contact as a lure. There are theories about what the backrooms actually are. Some propose it's a pocket dimension, a separate reality that exists parallel to ours, accessible through flaws or weak points in the barrier between worlds. Others suggest it's a construct, something built by intelligence we can't comprehend for purposes we'll never understand. Maybe a testing ground, or storage facility, or prison for beings that perceive reality differently than humans do. Some believe it's a manifestation of collective unconscious, the accumulated psychic weight of all the liminal spaces humans have created, office buildings and storage facilities and empty corridors, somehow coalescing into an actual space that exists outside normal geography. The most disturbing theory is that the backrooms are infrastructure, the literal backrooms of reality, the space where the architecture supporting our universe is located. What we experience as normal reality is the facade, the finished surface, but underneath and behind it is this vast network of maintenance corridors and empty rooms where the actual machinery of existence operates. When you no-clip, you're not traveling to another dimension. You're simply falling behind the scenery, ending up in areas that were never meant to be accessed by conscious beings, but that must exist for the conscious accessible areas to function. And if this is true, if the backrooms are fundamental infrastructure, then the entities inhabiting them might be maintenance workers or security systems, things that exist to keep the machinery running, that regard human intruders the way we'd regard a bug that somehow got inside a computer case, unwelcome, potentially damaging, to be removed or eliminated. The mythology of the backrooms has grown extensively online, with collaborative world-building creating increasingly elaborate lore about different levels, entities, survival strategies, and groups of survivors who've established territories or safe zones within the hostile environment. Skeptics correctly note that this is creepypasta, internet horror fiction, a collaborative creative project rather than documentation of a real place. The backrooms originated as a single image posted to a forum, a photograph of an empty room with yellow walls and fluorescent lighting that captured something unsettling about liminal architecture. And the mythology built from there, users contributing their own experiences and ideas until it became a vast shared universe of horror. But the reason the backrooms resonate so powerfully, the reason the concept spread so rapidly and inspired such extensive elaboration, is that it taps into something we all recognize. The feeling of being in a liminal space that exists only as transition between destinations. The uncanny unease of empty architecture that seems to serve no purpose. The nightmare logic of being trapped in a maze that won't let you leave, that reconfigures to keep you lost, where exhaustion and terror gradually erode your sanity. These are anxieties embedded deep in human consciousness, and the backrooms give them specific form and geography. There's also something about modern existence that the backrooms capture perfectly. We spend our lives in artificial environments, climate-controlled boxes lit by fluorescent tubes or LED panels, breathing recirculated air, walking on industrial carpet, surrounded by beige walls and drop ceilings. Office buildings, shopping malls, apartment complexes, airports, all designed with similar aesthetics, similar materials, similar proportions. The spaces blur together. You could be in Denver or Dallas or Detroit, and the interior spaces look identical. We've created liminal architecture as the dominant environment of modern life, places that exist purely functionally with no character, no identity, no evidence of human occupation beyond their shape. The backrooms are just the logical extension, the pure distillation of this aesthetic, stripped of even the minimal purpose that normal buildings serve. Whether the backrooms exist as actual place you could physically enter, as psychological space that people experience during mental breaks or sleep paralysis, or purely as collective fiction that resonates because it articulates modern anxieties, doesn't change the fact that the concept has power. It speaks to the fear of being lost, of being alone, of being trapped in an environment that makes no sense and offers no comfort. It captures the horror of endless empty rooms that go nowhere, of fluorescent lights that never turn off, of damp carpet and yellowed wallpaper, and the constant electrical hum of a place that exists purely to exist, without purpose or meaning or end. And late at night, when you're alone in a building, when you walk down a long hallway that seems slightly too empty, slightly too quiet, when you turn a corner and for just a moment you're not quite sure where you are or whether the space you're in connects back to where you started, there's a small voice that whispers, maybe it's possible. Maybe reality has weak spots. Maybe you could take one wrong step and fall through into endless yellow corridors that smell like mildew and desperation, into the buzzing fluorescent forever of the back rooms, where you'd wander until you died or changed into something that belongs there. Another entity haunting the liminal spaces between real places, waiting in the empty rooms behind reality for the next person to clip through and join you in the endless maze that has no exit, no purpose, no meaning except to exist as the infrastructure supporting everything else. The spaces between spaces, the rooms behind the world. The Devil's Footprints, unexplained tracks across 100 miles. On the morning of February 9th, 1855, residents of Devon, England woke to find fresh snow bearing tracks that would defy explanation for over a century and a half afterward. The prints appeared to have been made during the night, creating a trail that extended across more than 100 miles of countryside, crossing the rooftops of houses, scaling 14-foot walls, passing through narrow pipes and drainages that no normal creature could navigate, continuing in an unbroken line across the River Exe, where no bridge existed, ascending and descending without deviation from their perfectly straight course. The prints themselves were distinctive and deeply disturbing. They resembled hoof marks, small impressions roughly 4 inches long by 2 3/4 inches wide, but they appeared in single file, one after another in a perfectly straight line, as if whatever made them walked on 2 legs rather than 4, as if a bipedal creature with hooves had walked through Devon that night, covering impossible distance, traversing impossible obstacles, leaving a trail that suggested not an animal or human, but something else entirely, something that moved according to rules that didn't match any creature known to exist, something that people immediately, instinctively, identified with the devil himself. Because what else walks with hooves, in a straight line across 100 miles, over rooftops and through spaces too small for anything to pass, leaving tracks that appeared nowhere near human or animal, but rather like something from hell had decided to tour the English countryside and left its signature for everyone to see when morning came. The tracks were discovered by dozens of independent witnesses across multiple towns and villages: Topsham, Lympston, Exmouth, Teignmouth, Dawlish, and locations between, all reporting the same phenomenon: a line of hoof-like prints in fresh snow that had fallen overnight, spaced consistently about 8 inches apart, creating a trail that didn't meander or circle, but proceeded in almost militarily straight courses, as if whatever made them was moving with deliberate purpose from point A to point B, and nothing, not walls, not buildings, not rivers, was going to deter it from its path. The consistency of the reports is what makes the incident so compelling. These weren't isolated claims from a single location that could be dismissed as hoax or misidentification. Multiple communities witnessed the same tracks, described them in identical terms, and were collectively baffled by how any creature could have created them, given their distribution and the obstacles they crossed. The tracks went over rooftops, not around houses, but up one side, across the roof, and down the other side, maintaining the same spacing and appearance, as if gravity didn't affect whatever made them, as if walking vertically up a wall and across a pitched roof was as natural as walking on flat ground. They appeared on top of 14-foot walls, where snow hadn't been disturbed by any obvious means of ascent, as if whatever left them simply materialized at the top, or walked up the vertical surface. They continued through a haystack, entering one side, passing through the center where tunneling should have collapsed the structure, and emerging on the other side. They crossed the River Exe, appearing on both banks despite the water being too cold for most creatures to swim and no evidence of disturbance suggesting something had swum across. The spacing was unnaturally precise, 8 inches between each print, unwavering across the entire distance. No variation in stride length, no irregularities that would be expected from a living creature navigating varied terrain. Living things adjust their gait when climbing, when descending, when moving through difficult obstacles. These tracks maintained mechanical consistency as if stamped by a device or created by something that moved with machine-like regularity, regardless of what it was traversing. The prints themselves showed no variation in depth. They pressed into the snow uniformly, whether on flat ground, steep inclines, or the peaks of rooftops, suggesting whatever made them didn't have weight distribution that changed with angle, or didn't have weight, in the conventional sense that would press harder when climbing or lighter when descending. The shape of the prints was the most disturbing element. They resembled horseshoes or donkey hooves, but were smaller than any actual horse would produce. And crucially, they appeared in single file rather than the paired pattern that 4-legged animals create. Something with hooves was walking on 2 legs, or something with 2-hooved feet was walking, or something entirely different was leaving marks that happened to resemble hooves, because that's the closest visual analog human perception could construct from what was actually being impressed into the snow. The prints showed no signs of toes or claws that might indicate some other creature's track being misinterpreted. They were hoof-shaped, consistently so, across the entire 100-mile trail. The historical documentation is substantial because the incident occurred in Victorian England, where literacy was high, newspapers were active, and the phenomenon was significant enough that multiple accounts were published in the weeks following the discovery. The Illustrated London News covered it extensively. The Times received letters from witnesses. Local papers documented the tracks in their communities, and investigators attempted to follow and study them before the snow melted and they disappeared. This contemporary documentation rules out the possibility that the devil's footprints are modern fabrication or internet legend. They're documented 19th century phenomenon, witnessed by hundreds of people and reported in credible publications of the era. The theories proposed at the time ranged from the mundane to the supernatural. Some suggested the tracks were made by badgers, though badgers create completely different prints, don't walk in single file, and wouldn't cover 100 miles in one night or cross rivers and climb walls. Others proposed kangaroos, which would be absurd, except that a few kangaroos had recently been imported to private estates in England, raising the remote possibility that an escaped marsupial made some of the tracks. But kangaroos create distinctive prints, bound rather than walk, and one kangaroo couldn't have been in multiple locations simultaneously across such vast distance. Hares, otters, rats, various birds, all were suggested and all failed to account for the characteristics of the prints or the scope of their distribution. Balloons were proposed. Perhaps some scientific apparatus suspended from a balloon had dragged across the snow, creating the trail. But this doesn't explain the precision of the prints, the fact that they went through enclosed spaces and over obstacles that would have caught or deflected any suspended object, or how a balloon could have maintained such a straight course for 100 miles on a night when wind would have caused irregular drift. The balloon theory requires assuming the prints were made by something dragging from a flying object, but the prints showed defined shapes pressing down into snow, not the smeared or erratic marks that dragging would create. The supernatural explanation that many witnesses embraced immediately was that Satan himself or a demon had walked through Devon that night. The hoof marks were his signature, his calling card, evidence that evil had a physical presence and had chosen to manifest in southern England for reasons that could only be terrifying. The Victorian era was religious and superstitious enough that this explanation was taken seriously by significant portions of the population. Churches were packed the following Sunday as people sought protection and understanding. Some refused to leave their homes after dark. The psychological impact was profound. An entire region had been confronted with physical evidence that something incomprehensible and potentially malevolent had moved through their communities while they slept. The hoax theory is inevitable. Perhaps someone or a group created the tracks deliberately to cause panic or confusion. But the logistics of creating a 100-mile trail of consistent prints across multiple communities, over rooftops and walls, in a single night without being observed by anyone, using a method that produced perfectly spaced, hoof-shaped impressions, defeats plausibility. The effort required would be enormous, the risk of discovery high, and the absence of any confession or evidence of the hoax in the subsequent century and a half suggests that if it was a hoax, it was executed with sophistication that exceeds almost any documented historical prank. Modern theories have proposed unusual weather phenomena, cyclones or atmospheric conditions that created patterns in the snow that looked like prints. But meteorological formations don't create discrete, hoof-shaped impressions spaced regularly. Don't follow straight courses over varied terrain, and don't press into snow with the definition that witnesses described. Natural snow formations can create strange patterns, but they don't mimic the appearance of an animal track with such consistency that multiple observers in different locations describe them identically. Some researchers have suggested the tracks were made by multiple animals, that what appeared to be a continuous trail was actually several different sets of tracks from different creatures that coincidentally created a pattern that seemed connected. This might explain the distribution, but struggles with the consistency of description. Witnesses weren't describing vaguely similar tracks. They were describing identical tracks that appeared to be part of a single trail. Unless multiple creatures of the same species all decided to walk through Devon on the same night, following similar paths and producing identical prints, the coincidence required makes this explanation implausible. There are also theories involving experimental technology or vehicles that were being tested in the area and that created the tracks as a byproduct of their operation. Victorian England was the height of the Industrial Revolution, and secret experiments were certainly conducted. But what technology in 1855 could produce this effect? What device could traverse 100 miles, scale buildings, cross rivers, and leave precisely spaced hoof-like impressions without being seen or heard by anyone? The technology required seems far beyond what was available in that era, unless we assume classified development that was decades ahead of publicly known capabilities. The interdimensional theory proposes that the tracks were made by something not from our physical reality, but from an adjacent dimension or space that occasionally intersects with ours. If an entity from elsewhere passed through Devon that night, existing partially in our dimension and partially in its own, it might have left traces, physical impressions from whatever contact it made with our reality, while its actual form remained largely imperceptible to normal observation. This would explain why nothing was seen creating the tracks, why the tracks have characteristics that don't match any known creature, and why they appear to violate normal physics by going over obstacles without difficulty. The entity was moving through space that included both our dimension and others, and the tracks are the artifact of that movement impressing on our physical snow. The Devil's footprints were not unique to 1855. Similar phenomena have been reported in other times and places, though rarely with the documentation and witness scope of the Devon incident. In 1953, residents of Belgium reported mysterious tracks in snow that crossed improbable terrain and sparked similar speculation. Various reports from Russia, Scandinavia, and North America describe finding trails of prints that don't match known animals and that appear in locations or patterns that defy normal explanation. These subsequent incidents suggest the phenomenon isn't unique to Devon in 1855, but rather represents something that occurs rarely, but repeatedly, something that occasionally manifests and leaves physical traces before disappearing back into whatever state it normally occupies. The psychological residue of the devil's footprints lingers in Devon to this day. The incident is part of local history, commemorated and debated, with residents aware that their region was the site of something that was never explained, that left evidence too substantial to dismiss, but too strange to categorize. The mystery has an official quality, documented in newspapers and letters from the time, impossible to relegate to pure folklore or legend, because the primary sources exist. The contemporary accounts are too numerous and too consistent to ignore. What actually walked through Devon that February night remains unknown. Whether it was a creature unknown to science, an animal behaving in ways that don't match our understanding of animal behavior, a hoax executed with impossible sophistication, an atmospheric phenomenon that created illusions of purposeful tracks, a demonic entity leaving its mark on the physical world, an interdimensional traveler whose passage left impressions in our reality, or something else entirely that we lack the framework to even conceptualize. The tracks existed, were seen by hundreds of witnesses, were documented by credible sources, and have never been explained in ways that satisfy all the evidence. The prints covered over 100 miles, crossed obstacles that shouldn't be crossable, maintained consistency that shouldn't be achievable by any living creature moving through varied terrain, and then disappeared when the snow melted, leaving only the accounts and the persistent question of what could possibly create such a trail. The name Devil's Footprints reflects the immediate interpretation that something infernal had made them, that hooves in the snow could only mean one thing to a Christian population steeped in imagery of cloven-hoofed demons. But whether the interpretation was correct, whether something actually demonic walked through Devon, or whether the tracks came from a source that had nothing to do with religious concepts of evil, but that happened to create marks that matched those expectations, the incident remains as one of history's most documented and least explained anomalies. Something left tracks across southern England in 1855. Something walked or moved through multiple communities in a single night. Something impressed marks into fresh snow that looked like hooves, that followed straight lines across impossible distances and impossible obstacles, that have never been satisfactorily explained despite a century and a half of investigation and speculation. The Devil's Footprints walked through Devon once and left behind a mystery that endures because the evidence was too real to dismiss, too strange to explain, too consistent across too many witnesses to attribute to error or imagination, proving that sometimes the world produces phenomena that defy every attempt at rational explanation, that leave physical traces no theory can fully account for, that remain as permanent questions in the historical record, marks in the snow that melted away, but that the mystery they represent has never dissolved, has never been resolved, remains as vivid now as it was the morning residents of Devon looked out their windows and saw that something with hooves had walked through their world during the night, had left its signature across 100 miles of countryside, and had vanished before dawn without anyone seeing what made the marks. What walked with such inhuman consistency and such improbable ability to traverse obstacles? What left its calling card in the snow and then disappeared back into whatever realm it came from, leaving only the tracks, only the mystery, only the certainty that something happened that February night in 1855 that no one has ever managed to fully explain. Something that walked where it shouldn't have been able to walk, left prints that shouldn't exist, and entered history as the Devil's Footprints. A name that captures both the appearance of the evidence and the terrifying possibility that maybe, just maybe, that's exactly what they were. What